if you look at why is it that a company which was largely Scandinavian suddenly had this success in Holland, it takes it from my world to your world.
Right.
In that tech companies and telcos have long tried to bundle each other's properties, and most of the time it falls flat on its arse. It goes nowhere. But I can testify here on your podcast, the day that Spotify went into bed with KPN, the original monopoly telco of Holland, it just flew like a bird.
Hello and welcome to another Telecoms.com podcast. I'm delighted to say we've got a very special guest. The first time we've had another podcaster, I would be self-facing, say a proper podcaster as opposed to what we do, who's Will Page. Will Page, you are the former chief economist at Spotify, the author of, remind me the name of your book again?
The book is a paperback, it's called Pivot, is a hardback Tarzan economics.
Ah, there we go. That's why I got confused. I was wondering whether he'd done two books, but they've just got different names for the paperback.
The reason why was W.H. Smith's Travel met my publisher and said, we love Will's book. We really want to support it. We want to put it on our tables in the airports, but books with economics in our titles don't sell in airports. So we had to rebrand it, retitle it, and come out. So there's a lesson for future authors.
Right. And you couldn't have just put Tarzan. That would have been very confusing. And then you also, as I just alluded to, a proper podcast. So you've got a pod that I've listened to a few episodes of. I must admit, only since I knew that you were going to come on. But I have really enjoyed them, called Bubble Trouble, which is sort of more general, like business markets, financial markets, and the clue in the name is that you look for sort of bubbles, i.e. artificially inflated economic activity.
And as the stock market goes down, our audience goes up. So it's correlation and causation right there.
So your audience would be a lot of people who are financial speculator types, would it?
Yeah, people trying to understand, for example, if half the stocks go up and half the stocks go down, why do analysts put buy notices on everything?
Right.
You know, there's some simple arithmetic there tells you this is not how financial markets actually work. So we like to expose the sycophants and stenographers on Wall Street for what they do.
Yeah, well, I just listened to your one today, and one of the things you spoke about, actually, which I remember first came to my attention during the mortgage crisis, the 2007-8 one, is how conflicted the credit rating agencies, and I don't know if you mentioned it, but I'll add it, the regulators often are, because they have all sorts of conflicts of interest, and obviously the credit rating, and the auditors. You know, when the credit rating agencies and the auditors are paid for by the people they're rating and auditing, of course there's a conflict of interest, and yet it's completely embedded in the whole...
Marking your own homework.
Marking your own homework, exactly. So it's bizarre. So, I mean, you got our audience, you got a taste of how this might not be a typical Telecoms.com podcast, because although, as we'll come to, Will has good knowledge of the sort of tech industry on the whole, pure play telecoms isn't a passion of yours, to the best of my knowledge. So I think we're going to keep it a bit more general, but I think that's quite a fun departure. But before we get onto that, and having said that we're not going to get deep into the weeds of telecoms, I think we should have a chat about what Ian's been up to this week. So firstly, I'll give a shout out to Orange, isn't it? Orange took us to the Rugby World Cup in Lille. There were plenty of Scotch people there, Will, who presumably didn't particularly enjoy the game.
Thanks for reminding me about that. And after Scotland-Spain last night...
bad luck. Yeah.
The goal disallowed.
Yes.
Fairly.
Yeah.
There was
yet another VAR incident,
was a corner in, and it was like, it was a crappy VAR decision.
Right, there's a lot of them about.
Yeah.
I hadn't watched rugby in 10 years before this World Cup, and I hate it now. There's so many little fouls.
Right.
That's the problem, is you can't understand what's going on.
Yeah, I wonder how much you'll hate it if France wins, eh?
Well.
It's growing on me.
Yeah, probably Ireland.
So, but that was great. England were quite shit. There was one quite funny bit, actually, talking about France. So we're in France, and basically the whole stadium that wasn't England wanted Samoa to win, perhaps assisted by the fact that Samoa wear blue. So there was lots of Allez les Bleus sort of going on. And there were these French guys immediately behind us in the stands, and they were just cheering every English fuck up, every Samoan, and they did play well, to be fair, the Samoans. And they were clapping so hard I was getting a parting in the back of my head. And I was just thinking, let us stomp them so I can turn around and get some good jingoistic aggro going. But in the end, we just squeaked by 1 point. So I turned around to all of them and shook them individually by the hand and just said, we were shit, we were shit, we were shit.
There was quite good sports about it.
Yeah, well, there we were. I mean, you know, if I think if I tried to make out that we were brilliant, then they might not be such good sports, but we really weren't. Anyway, so thanks, Orange. That was good fun. And then immediately after that, Ian... we were quite knackered the next day because we are our usual unsensible selves, weren't we? And then, I got to go home and just have some kit. But you had to go off to Madrid. So tell us what you got up to.
So it was a Fuse event. I don't know why they called it Fuse.
Yeah, FYUZ as well, which is even more annoying.
You think it should stand for something, or it's like maybe some reference to some tech, but it isn't. So, but yeah, it's the Telecom Infra project. Basically.
TIP. Yeah.
I think last year they did it with the ORAN Alliance as well, but then they weren't involved in it this year.
But it's still quite ORAN-y.
It's very ORAN-y, I would say. I mean, they were thinking it was...
Sorry, Will, we'll get through this quickly.
More on a range of other techs as well, but I thought it was kind of dominated by Open RAN. And like the guy who's the chair of TIP at the moment is Santiago Tenorio, who's also network architecture director at Vodafone.
And you had a really good interview with him just leading up to it as well.
But his big preoccupation is Open RAN, so...
Yeah. So any,
not surprising.
We'll keep it short and sweet, especially as we haven't got a ton of time this week. Any particular things jump out on that?
I mean, the interview I did with him, which is up now, so, he sort of, because we covered this issue of the Huawei swap out in the UK, and he sort of pushed back a bit on the idea that a lot of it's gone to Ericsson. I always thought they'd sent out this impression that what they wanted to do, they've got about 6,000 sites that are Huawei sites, was do the 2,500 deployment that they're doing on Open RAN, and then maybe if it worked out well, kind of extend it further. But it looks like the other sort of 3,500 have gone to Ericsson.
Right.
And he was very kind of, that was always in the plan. They're obviously going to be able to move faster because it's a ready technology, whereas, what Samsung and the other people are doing on Open RAN's kind of in development. And then he was a bit kind of also resistant to this idea they've dropped NEC. If you remember the original...
Everyone gets quite sensitive about whether or not they're
the thing is, if they don't have
but...
NEC in, it's almost not really Open RAN in a way.
Right.
It's kind of Open RAN, but that front haul interface between the radios and the baseband equipment, that's the bit that everybody wants to be. They want to get their components from different people. So he was like, well, NEC is still in the mix, even though they didn't mention it in their last announcement. It is still there. It's just kind of in the lab, and that they're going to have that up and running.
It just all seems quite messy. Again, I won't get into it now, but, I wrote a little bit. You've written in much greater depth on it, as is often the case, but about this, like, look-aside versus inline
really
processor thing.
Yeah, I won't get
exactly.
into that now.
No, but I think the reason we bring it up is there seems to be so many little bits going on with Open
there are.
that are massively complicated.
I won't go into that one. I mean, the other big takeaway was, so last year they had this big thing where Nokia's like got behind Open RAN, and it's like, well, hey, it's brilliant that one of the big Nordic vendors is now supporting this concept. A little bit odd, because one of the ideas of it, obviously, is to have alternatives to Huawei that aren't the two Nordic companies, and therefore have sort of competition in the market. So Nokia's sort of swinging behind it. It makes you think, well, if they go and buy all their stuff from Nokia anyway, isn't it sort of in? And then this year it was Ericsson. So I remember sort of going down the steps, and Eugenia, who's sort of on the marketing side at TIP, was like, oh, there's going to be a special guest appearing. I was like, oh, hello, who's this going to be then? And Frederick Yedling turns up he didn't come in, but he turned up on the screen. Yeah. And they had Matteo Fiorani, who's like the head of the kind of Cloud RAN product line, who I've spoken to on the phone a few times before, but they're not members of TIP. They're kind of seen as very opposed to that whole thing, and so it's even more kind of surprising in a way, I suppose, that they're involved. And they've been making these positive noises about Cloud RAN and how they're adapting their products over the last few months. But having him there kind of was sort of seen as quite a big coup, I think, by Tenorio. Right. But again, you're sort of thinking it's almost like the big Nordic incumbents are infiltrating.
Yeah, we'll take it from here.
Yeah. And then I wonder. I mean, this is one of the problems with the whole concept, is this idea of using. I mean, this was mentioned actually on one of the opening sessions by a guy from AT&T. It was like the AT&T, Ericsson, Nokia together are spending about $5 billion on R&D in the RAN area each year. You've got companies like Mavenir and Parallel Wireless, which is really struggling now. I think they laid off a few hundred people last year. Altistar is now part of Rakuten. There aren't a lot of these challengers that have that kind of muscle, and this is one of those industries where scale kind of matters. Yeah. Having three, it's like the chip industry.
It's never seemed likely it was going to be that complete free market, free for all.
Yeah,
that it was painted to be. Well, look, mate, I'm gonna nip that in the bud there. But I think there's an opportunity in the future to get really in the weeds on some of those nuances that came out of that. So yeah, I'll turn it back. So, yeah, I warned you there might be a bit of Telecoms Arcana to start with.
How many acronyms did I just hear there in 7 minutes?
Welcome to our world,
I
mate.
call your world alphabet soup.
Yeah. No, it's almost...
Tip's quite interesting from an economics point of view because Tip was founded by Facebook, Meta as it is now. And the whole idea was to try and lower the cost of network equipment. So I think their ulterior motive is to have low-cost equipment that can be rolled out in parts of Africa, for instance, more easily, or it's too expensive to build fibre networks. And they wanted to kind of spur innovation and have products that will be available for parts of the world where they can't provide services. So they sort of wade into the telecom sector with this initiative. But they've actually almost pulled out. It's more an operator thing now. I mean, Meta did have a booth there, but they've had a lot of job losses themselves, and I think that Facebook connectivity division, as it was called, has been completely gutted.
It was a big deal a few years ago.
But you notice the difference. Like you went to a Facebook run event, food, anything you want. Like there's drinks being brought around. This year it was. I mean, I almost feel a bit bad for saying it, but it was a lot more kind of like low cost.
Tapas wasn't so good this year.
I didn't think so. Yeah, it seemed like it had gone a bit more like typical telecom event.
Yes.
Sort of,
The impression I get is they might be pulling out of Tip. They also seem to be pulling out of London as well. They've withdrawn from a couple of offices.
Yeah.
The office in Coldrops Yard, I've never seen more than 6 people inside that entire building. I look at it every day. It's quite incredible. So, yeah.
Interesting. It's not like they're short of a bob. Okay, so let's bring it back to you, Will. So yeah, like I said, it's novel, and welcome to have someone who telecoms isn't their day job.
Yep.
But obviously we're a business focused podcast, and Ian and I are business technology business writers, and so there does seem to be a fair bit of overlap. But let's just start at the beginning. Let's start with the reason you're on the pod in the first place, because it's not that we just bumped into you in a pub. The reason you're on the pub is a previous guest, Rosalind Layton of Strand Consult. She figured that there was a good fit in terms of we should all chat to each other, and so we got in touch on email. And today's the first time we've met face to face. So what was your connection with Rosalind?
Rosalind kind of came out of the blue at me. You meet these amazing people from the telco community who bring their perspective to the world, and we're going back here to 2012, very early in Spotify's development. Had launched in Norway, had launched in Sweden, had done a bunch of sort of large European market launches. And the story back then was just Spotify's big in Sweden, Spotify's big in Norway, and that's it. Every man, woman, cat, dog, and pet hamster's got Spotify in Sweden, and that's it. You'll never get any further.
Right.
And then we got big in Holland, and I was tasked with explaining why we got big in Holland. So
you were pretty early to Spotify yourself?
I remember Daniel Ek when he had hair. So if you look at why is it that a company which was largely Scandinavian suddenly had the success in Holland, it takes it from my world to your world.
Right.
In that tech companies and telcos have long tried to bundle each other's properties, and most of the time it falls flat on its arse. It goes nowhere. But I can testify here on your podcast, the day that Spotify went into bed with KPN, the original monopoly telco of Holland, it just flew like a bird. And it's seen as a test case around the world. People from Netflix have constantly asked, explain to me that Spotify KPN case study. And what was so fascinating about it, well, I'll unpack a few things here for you, is firstly the Dutch market itself. Just like their cannabis laws, their copyright laws are kind of relaxed. Because there's a levy to compensate for the harm of piracy, going to BitTorrent and downloading an illegal file is not unlawful in Holland. So Spotify scaled in a country where piracy, the thing that we're trying to kill off, wasn't even against the law. So the one country you didn't think it was going to happen in, it happened big time. Secondly, the way that KPN viewed the partnership with Spotify was, we want to pay to rebrand our company. We appear that stodgy old monopoly telco brand, we want to appear hip again. So what they were acquiring was a rebranding mechanism. What Spotify needed, with only 4 people in the country at the time, was scale. So you had these misaligned incentives that both moved in the same direction. You want to rebrand your telco, we want to find scale, and we don't have the headcount to do it. We don't have the boots on the ground to achieve it. So they rolled Spotify into the KPN bundle, and within the first year, I think we're looking at about 750,000 subscribers.
Interesting. Wow. And when you say rolled into the bundle, that means that the
sort of premium bundle of, we want to rebrand the company and rebrand the bundle offering. We're going to offer bells and whistles package, and included in that, hard bundled, billed by the telco
amazing
itself,
music streaming service.
A streaming service.
Yeah.
But that's part of the story. The bit that Rosalind was fascinated in was that not just did KPN subscribers grow, but organic subscribers grew even faster. And that's network effects. That's 1/3 of a lecture hall at Dutch University saying, hey, we're making these great playlists on Spotify and sharing them.
Right.
And the other 2/3 say, well, I want a piece of that action too. So the biggest fear that you had from record labels and from our company's perspective was, is this going to cannibalize organic growth?
Yeah.
The opposite happened. A rising tide lifted both boats, thanks to a telco putting its firepower behind a very small tech company.
So that is really interesting. And given, I mean, you're only talking about 11 years ago, but it feels like a lifetime in the tech industry, and certainly in the history of Spotify. Although, of course, you've got this unique sort of early insight into the company. But it does make me wonder why that wasn't replicated more, or was it? And I just didn't realise.
That's something which is interesting, which is why did it work there, but not necessarily work anywhere? I don't have enough fingers and toes to count the number of Duff telco deals Spotify has done it really well. But that one is just seen as best in class. And maybe a few things to add to it. One, I think the Dutch people are early adopters. Spotify's first non-Scandinavian market was Holland. Netflix's first non-American market was also Holland. So when they see convenience, they say, I'll have that, I'll buy that.
So there's something culturally about the Dutch.
Didn't they launch Disney Plus there as well? Outside the US first?
I believe so, yeah. It's like it's where you want to take your guinea pig, your test case market.
So there's just somehow particularly receptive to new sort of digital products there, I guess.
Is that partnership still going on then, the KPN Spotify?
I think it must have whittled its way down. I'm sure there's ways of sort of grandfathering existing customers.
Because I'm just wondering, I mean, one of the things that Rosalind's really into is this sort of net neutrality issue.
This is why she engaged.
Yeah, this combining of, I know some telcos have ended up in law courts in Europe for doing things like you can use Deezer or Spotify and it can count against your usage, but anybody else that we don't have a deal with, then it's going to come off your monthly gigabyte allocation, and it's sort of seen by some people anyway, and some lawyers obviously as a sort of infringement of net neutrality. But I'm just kind of wondering if that's got in the way for them.
No, I think what Rosalind's engagement on that net neutrality point was, this is a market solving its own problems. That's her key premise, and I think she's countless amounts of regulations to try and stop piracy. My industry spent 10 years since Napster threatening your industry with words like 3 strikes and you're out. And I was heavily involved as a one-eyed man in the kingdom of the blind saying that's going to make matters worse. And getting threatened with the sack for saying those words as well. But, it's interesting to see how the telco industry and the music industry got into bed together and made the world a better place. KPN now is arguably a really hit brand in Holland. They got involved in sponsorship of festivals. They expanded their role in music. And, now the Dutch music industry is seen as a beacon of success from being an abject failure 10 years ago. So it's just really interesting to see that. But then to stress, small fish, big pool, music is small compared to your world. The amount of zeros on the end of your figures that you discuss, many more zeros than you'd ever see in a music industry discussion. And I remember asking KPN about their marketing budget for Spotify, and I worked out KPN had more marketing euros to spend on Spotify than the entire Dutch music industry combined.
Right.
Wow.
So when you stick that on your rebrand exercise, you're going to see results. And then maybe to wrap it up, one last thing to say about what KPN, a telco, a stodgy old telco, achieved in our sexy world of music, is it's so important for your audience to appreciate the Dutch story. Because we scaled in Holland really early, long before we scaled in Britain, we were able to put boots on the ground in the Dutch office and have local curators. That was a new foreign concept to the company. And because we had local curators, we started seeing local music rise to the top of the charts. And to round off what KPN achieved for the company in Holland, by 2017, I remember presenting this data point, which was that Drake is the biggest artist in the world on Spotify, the Canadian artist Drake, number 1 globally. In Holland, he was the 8th biggest hip-hop artist, and the 7 above him were Dutch rappers rapping in Dutch. So from a stodgy telco that wanted to rebrand itself to seeing local music thrive in its local language, it really is a telco success story.
I guess because I remember going all the way back to the Napster thing, partly because I'm wearing a Guns N' Roses t-shirt today, but I'm also a Metallica fan. And Metallica were a very big part of the Napster story, weren't they?
Yeah.
Lars Ulrich went after them quite hard. And I remember as a metal fan being a bit conflicted because it felt like they were being...
He was laying into them, was he?
Yeah, because Metallica, I mean... I imagine Will's got a much better recollection of this, but I'll give you briefly my point of view from the time. And this is more like around 2000 or something. This is like 20 plus years ago.
Yeah.
But Metallica stuff was being file shared a lot. That was when file sharing was a bit more of a new thing, and you'd have BitTorrents and all sorts, and people just...
Kaza.
And just the concept of being able to share like MP3s for free was obviously very alarming to the people who own the copyrights of these things. And Metallica went after Napster, which was a big exponent of that, quite hard, and I think contributed to their downfall. But I mean, that's my sort of vague recollection of it.
They were definitely the most outspoken of the Napster wars,
Right.
which is interesting. And they were also very hesitant about the streaming solution. You know,
Yes.
you're going to collapse the value of an album. How's this going to work?
It's another whole premise of Spotify.
Yeah, and in 2012, maybe 2013, early 2013, they rolled onto the service. And I was at the press conference when Lars got on stage and explained why. And he said, it's my kids.
Yeah.
My kids aren't going to go and buy CDs or downloads. They
So
don't
he's
even know what those things are. They wouldn't even know how to open a CD player. So if you can bring a horse to the water or water to a horse,
Very sensible.
if I want the next generation to learn about Metallica songs, which they are doing, not just on Spotify or now TikTok, for example, then you got to go and enter the world of streaming. So,
But it has sort of devalued music, hasn't it, in a way? I think that the artists have got a point that nobody pays for. They make their money out of concerts, don't they, because they've been forced to.
Straight into Will's territory here.
well,
Let's see what this is.
You know, you used to be able to, get a number one single, top of the pops, and sell enough singles and LPs to, sort of live quite happily in the sort of Beatles era, and then nobody pays any money
no
for
one is
music at all.
denying that it's hard to make a living from streaming revenues. That's accepted. But some historical context first, and then a little bit of arithmetic second. Artists complained in the age of vinyl, postage, package distribution costs. They complained in an age of CDs. They complained in the age of downloads. You're just buying one download for 99 cents as opposed to an album. Did that do more harm than piracy? Discuss. They complained in an age of piracy, and they complained in the age of streaming. The one constant here is that artists like to whinge.
Yeah.
That whinging
And record
is
labels
relative.
as well. Yeah.
Yeah. But then the second part is just a very quick bit of education. So I'll give you an example. Let's imagine that this room here listens to one radio show, and it's the BBC Radio 2 Breakfast Radio Show. Big popular show, 8.3 million listeners. If your song gets played on that radio show, the songwriter will receive £90 and the artist will receive £60.
Per-
Add that together, 150 per play.
Right.
Gets played again, there's another £150. And you would be right to say, hold on, £150 for a play, and I'm getting half a penny for a stream? This is bonkers. How can anyone accept this model? Then you have to do the arithmetic.
The audience.
£150 to 8.3 million people
Yeah.
is 0.00004p per stream.
Yeah.
Now, if those 8.3 million people then ran off to Spotify to play the song after hearing on a breakfast show, which is very plausible, you walk out with 40,000.
Yeah.
And that's the arithmetic which I've been explaining since 2008. And every time a manager holds me by the neck and says, Spotify's the devil, and I run them through that math, they put me back down on the floor and buy me a pint. So thanks for the beers. But that's a really, really important point, is just sheer understanding of what this model should not be compared with radio. It should not be compared with sales. It sits somewhere in between as an economic rationale for the way it is.
Yeah, and go ahead, Pierre.
Now, how do they fight to make it so? Because I feel like it's always top heavy, where the top 10 artists make,
Yeah, sort of Pareto
they get a check
distribution
for like
type thing.
100 million. And then if you're the 40th artist, you make like maybe 1 million, maybe 500,000. Like it's way, it's really top heavy with the Drakes, the Ed Sheerans.
It's the same with anything.
Taylor
though.
Swift.
Look at tennis.
Well, I came to a Telco 2.0 conference in 2008 to debunk the long tail theory. And the work was so profound, I got onto the cover of New Scientist magazine.
Nice one.
Which made my big brother proud of me at last. But the journalist from New Scientist was asking, why does Amazon always offer more than it stocks? It stocks the head, it sources the tail of marketplace. It's using classic statistical inventory control mechanisms. All schools of retail, you have to rent your space to belong on the shelf. And you'll see that in music. But one thing I would say about understanding the long tail of music, and your audience be well attuned to understanding Pareto distributions, logarithmic distributions, is be careful about percentages and absolute values. So if I said to you 1% of all the songs on Spotify or 1% of all the artists on Spotify generate 95% of all the wealth, well, there's more choice in that 1%, in those 1% of 9 million artists or that 1% of 120 million tracks than there ever was in the bricks and mortars world.
Yeah,
So we have to be very
show
competitive
my age there.
about the expansion of supply. And that's a really, really important point.
Yeah.
And then the point I think about, that it seems that Lars Ulrich, the drummer of Metallica, eventually made is just looking facts in the face. Once we got into the era where everyone had MP3 players and everyone had connected computers and then eventually phones, which usurp the MP3 players, then people were going to be file sharing. So then it's just a matter of, do we then produce a service that is so desirable to the end user that they'd rather pay for that than go through moody little, possibly virus-infested little peer-to-peer file sharing things. And, and that's where you get into the pricing. And I'm sure you were right in the middle of all that when you were at Spotify.
Yeah.
What is the sustainable price level? And I guess that dictates, to your point, Pierre, and yours, Ian, to some extent, I would imagine it dictates what Spotify can then pay the artists, because they'll have all kinds of models on how much money they're likely to get from the market on the whole, and thus what they can distribute. And so it seems like a pure, obviously, as Ian was saying, back in the day, like, in the 70s, and Deep Purple will come out an album and they could just bathe in champagne for years on the back of it. Obviously, there isn't the margin. There isn't just the gross profit. But then the other thing they've done, I think, again, Metallica's, that they're quite innovative, is it feels like the whole paradigm's been flipped. So you used to, let's say in the 70s, you used to tour in order to promote the album and you make your money from the album. Now you relatively give your music away in order to promote the tour, and then people pay £100, as I did for this gig, this Guns N' Roses t-shirt I'm wearing.
So you paid the equivalent of 1 year subscription to Spotify for a fading grey rock t-shirt.
Yeah, we are. Well, it wasn't fading. It wasn't fading 7 years ago, to be fair.
It looks better now.
He's very
No, 6 years ago.
Well, you didn't buy your t-shirt pre-faded? Come on, that's passé.
No, this is faded the old-fashioned way.
That's a regular, makes a regular appearance on the podcast.
Yeah, that's one of my. I've got a sort of a shamefully small stable of about 10 metal t-shirts.
Yeah, you did Slayer, the same Slayer, 2 podcasts in a row. The last one and the one before.
Did I? Same Slayer t-shirt.
I was looking at the thumbnail like, wait, is this the right one?
I know. Well, what can I say?
All mine are blue, so.
Well, I mean,
I've got to get some new ones.
I'm sure there's a lot of engineers that listen to your show, and one point I'd say to that part of your audience is to think about the engineering story of Spotify as well. I mean, step back. When we woke up to Napster in June 1999, we went to the internet and we accessed any song that we wanted. If you go to Spotify in October 2013, you go to the internet and you access any song you wanted. What the consumer actually does hasn't changed much.
Yeah.
We've just wrapped a licensing model around it to get value out. And we now have a business which is worth $25 billion, 80% of which is people paying a recurring fee for Spotify.
Really, the ads are only 20%?
So the rest of the market, ads, CDs, downloads, whatever, but it's just a complete, we have around the world now well over 500 million people paying for something that's voluntary to pay. We could all stop paying for music today and continue to consume it for the rest of our lives.
Yeah.
We
Further
are
to my point,
volunteering a monthly fee. It's an incredible success story.
Because Spotify's made it worthwhile.
They did. Now, our engineer here mentioned Kazaa, which was one famous piracy site. There are others which I'm sure you used as a law-abiding citizen. uTorrent might ring a bell.
He's just read about.
I don't use torrent ever.
Pirate Bay.
Yeah, well, I've heard of them.
He's nodding.
I know of them. I know of them. But
He's not naughty, Pierre. He's a good boy.
What's interesting about Kazaa, uTorrent, and Pirate Bay, to name but a few, is they're all Swedish.
Right.
Oh, really?
So the engineers who
As is
built these
Spotify.
piracy sites, in Scotland we say poacher and gamekeeper, the engineers that built these piracy sites were also the same engineers that went over to build
Right.
Spotify. So I want to stress, horse to water, water to the horse, what's actually changed from the consumer perspective is very little. What's changed from the licensing and the creative perspective is a transformation. But what the engineers did to make Spotify win and piracy lose was very clever, and it's documented loosely correctly in the Netflix drama The Playlist, which is they focused on the speed of the play button. I'll paraphrase the story. Daniel said to a horseshoe of engineers, right, which one of you engineers is going to make this play button fast? I want it to feel like you've got millions of your songs in your pocket instantly. And one engineer said, I'll take that one and do what engineers do, which economists don't do, which is to ask what in metric terms does instant mean? Excuse me, psychology professor, but in metric terms, what does instant mean? Like you press a light switch and the light comes on. Is that instant or was there a delay? And the answer was 285 milliseconds. At that point,
That's what I would have said.
the human, of
I would have
course,
said 283.
Close.
at that point, the human brain can't see delay. It's
Yeah.
impossible for it to see delay. Thank you, professor. I'm now eat cold
I've got something to
pizza,
aim for.
drink flat Coca-Cola for 3 months and code the play button that we all press play today. So when you press play, the music starts instantly. And the challenge I would say to any of the piracy people back then or even today is try stealing music faster than that.
Yeah.
I don't want to steal music because I want to stick it to the man.
It's the availability.
It's availability and it's convenience.
Convenient.
And what Spotify did is they made more available, more conveniently.
And just those in this digital era when everyone's got a incredibly powerful, more powerful than the computers they sent the Apollo mission to the moon in their pocket.
We all have because what he just said was a bit of a Operation Paperclip,
right?
But in tech,
right?
So we're gonna get the pirates to work for us.
So, I mean, we all have these first world problems where if there is a bit of a delay, I'm like, oh fuck's sake. And it's it's a massive first world problem.
Children cry when films buffer on their apps.
Right. Well, there we are.
Well, the Wi-Fi doesn't work on a plane.
Yeah, exactly.
You take it out an air hostess.
What was that comedian who's just going? You're in a tube in the middle of the sky. Louis C.K. Yeah.
You're in a chair flying in the sky.
Yeah. Yeah. Before I do want to get onto your books, I'm genuinely interested, and I haven't. I'm not a very diligent researcher, so I haven't read it prior to this.
I didn't even know you've written a book.
No, that's not your fault. I'm the host.
Tell me.
That's
I thought there was only one writer in this room.
Yes, that's true. Well, Will did email me to say, have you bought my book? And I noticed it came out in 2021. I thought of emailing going, well, I released a book in 2021. I'll buy yours if you buy mine. So maybe I'll get back to you on that. Yeah, just one other thing that occurred to me from that Spotify chat before we move it on. Was the concept of net neutrality, and you were talking about how that was an interest of Rosalind, and that certainly came up when we had her on the pod at the start of this year. Ian and I have often argued the toss about net neutrality, about whether zero rating, i.e. not charging someone for a bit of content, counts as is even a net neutrality issue, let alone a violation. I insist it isn't. I think net neutrality is about the quality of the traffic rather than what you charge for it. But you're a bit more sympathetic.
It's not whether I'm sympathetic. It's so hazily defined that it's up for legal debate.
Okay.
It's the same thing as fair contribution.
The subjectivity of what is quality traffic.
It's exactly the same as fair contribution. If you ask whether it's an infringement of net neutrality, the telcos will go, no, it's not. We've asked our lawyers. We had that very recently, if you remember, at a dinner that we can't talk about because it was off the record.
Right, okay.
But if you ask the Amazon lawyers and the Netflix lawyers, they'll say, well, actually, our lawyers disagree with that. So
well, I suppose it's in that ballpark because with fair contribution, they're asking them to pay some extra.
Well, the reason I think it's possibly discriminatory is because they're asking the top few, what they call large traffic generators, which is a term I don't really like, to contribute, but nobody else does. So number 5 might be only slightly bigger than number 6 in terms of how many gigabytes are on the network.
Yeah, so there's like cut-off point
services, and number 6 doesn't pay anything, and number 5 does, and it's kind of it's to do with network, the treatment of services on the network basically, because it's a payment for it.
No, and I take your point that the treatment, there's lots of ambiguity and vagueness baked into what constitutes a treatment. Yeah. And I guess one of the reasons I'm throwing this at you, Will, and if you don't have a strong position on it, that's fine. But I do remember this coming up, I think it might have been O2, or someone was offering Spotify for free, bundled in. Yeah. So free at the point of purchase.
Yep.
And that caused a net neutrality furore. So I don't know if you have...
There've been law cases about it in Europe. Yeah. Deutsche Telekom's been in court overdoing that very thing.
Right. Yeah. So I don't know if you have a view on whether zero rating, as opposed to favouring traffic in a qualitative way, fits into the net neutrality debate.
I know the net neutrality debate is deeper than Loch Ness. Yeah. And I'm a shallow water swimmer on this one.
That's totally fine.
I struggle with it. But what I do, if I dust down my old net neutrality textbooks that I never read, what it did remind me of was the question of sender pays data, which I think aligns quite closely with this. So currently,
that definitely aligns with the fair contribution debate.
Right. And then you have the notion of receiver pays. I pay X to Virgin Media to get broadband to my house.
Yeah.
But then the question of sender pays. And as a student in front of his professors on this topic, all I could offer your audience is perhaps a lesson from history.
Sure.
Which is, if we go back to 1851, we had something in this country called the Royal Mail. And the Royal Mail was not doing particularly well. The network effects weren't particularly there. And an economist called Roland Hill turned up and looked at the model. And he said, currently, this doesn't work because we have receiver pays. You went to the post office and paid to receive your mail.
Yeah.
He said, let's flip it. Let's turn it to sender pays. And that means there's no risk in receiving. So you de-risk from the receiver's perspective. And the Royal Mail took off. And I mean, I'm not saying this is a directly relevant point.
No, but it's a really interesting perspective.
The Loch Ness Trench of net neutrality debates, but it's just to remember, in history, we've seen this thing go from where, in two-sided market theory, when you introduce MasterCard, the merchant takes 7%, the consumer sees 0%, and the card took off. So I'm interested in these network effects which affected.
Yeah,
what
that's
makes it work.
definitely one of the arguments with fair contribution, because there's this idea that the notion that the big internet companies are traffic generators is on the premise that they send the data over the network, whereas the customer on the other end of it is requesting that data. And that's like a point of debate. So someone like Roslyn, who's very much on the side of the idea that big tech should contribute.
She quite likes
costs,
the idea of fair contribution, doesn't she?
She would like the description of those companies as
we're not so into
generators. We're sort of more on the other side of it, really. But even though we're in the telecom sector and we should be sympathetic towards the telcos, we're more on the internet company side of this one. But
one other amateur point just to make is from Mobile World Congress. The most impressive presentation I saw this year, and I think this stands as one of the most impressive addresses I've seen in many years, was from Netflix, and just looking at the investment they've made to manage these costs. Now, that's the market resolving a market problem without the need for regulation, which makes you think, do you need regulation? Do you need the threat of regulation for Netflix to get off its backside and develop that incredible tech spectrum that they have to control those content delivery costs? I think there's a very interesting debate there in terms of how does the market sort itself out.
I might put a pin in that nascent discussion about Wait, so I'm.
We're not dying.
Yeah, Pete and I are in here. Both Ian and Will got a bit of a bug. I might put a pin in that regulation thing, so we might well come to that, time permitting. But let's move it on. So I gathered from my cursory research, which basically consists of noting you have a Wikipedia page, which is impressive enough by itself, that you left Spotify in order to write a book.
I did.
So why don't you tell us about that book?
So my passion's teaching. I'd like to teach anyone from primary school kids to chief executives. My dad taught me how to teach economics when I was 11 years old, which was interesting. He taught me how to teach the subject before I actually knew what the subject was.
So was your dad an economist as well?
He was.
Right.
And he always said, the key to teaching economics is you focus on an audience who, A, doesn't think they're going to understand it.
Yeah.
B, doesn't want to understand it, but C, has to. That's the audience your job is to teach, and not to go to academic conferences and convince each other that these Greek formulas make more sense than each other. No. How do you get economics across to an audience who doesn't think, want, or will have to understand this subject? That's what you're preaching. And as a lonely economist in a sea full of lawyers of the music industry, that has been my job for the past 15 years. So Spotify went public in 2018, April 2018. Interestingly, the New York Stock Exchange in their wisdom flew the Swiss flag outside.
Brilliant. It's all the bloody same. There's all Europe in it.
And their apologies said, hey, Spotify, we all make mistakes and Switzerland's got great chocolates.
Okay.
13 years of blood, sweat and tears to get there, and that's your finale. But we went there, and then I was just thinking, like, maybe now's the time to document the book. And my passion here was to explain to everyone else how to navigate your Napster moment. So we spent 10 years suffering, fighting change, suing customers, suing ISPs, suing platforms.
We being the music industry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then we spent 10 years embracing change. It's like, does it have to take that long? So the book is designed to avoid the suffering, get straight to the recovering. The book was called Tarzan Economics as a Hardback, came out during the pandemic. And then this year came out as its paperback form, Pivot.
And what's the longer name of it?
8 Principles for Navigating Disruption.
Right.
And I think the subtitles kind of moved around with the different titles as well. It's had 5 translations.
Yeah.
Germany, Chinese, Taiwan, Japan, and it's selling in Korea. Any Koreans listening?
Right.
The book is selling shit. I don't know what it says, but it's selling in Korea.
Nice one. It's definitely doing better than my book then.
It's really taken off. I actually met Richard Thaler, who went on to win the Nobel Prize, and asked him about Nudge. And he said to me, I've sold more copies of Nudge in Korea than I did in the rest of the world combined.
Interesting.
So
they
like
like a bit of economics. And I presume we're talking about South Korea.
No, my book tour is North Korea only.
Niche.
They'd love to talk about economics in North Korea.
Yeah. But, it's been interesting. The Audible book is out as well. Angus King a very, very decent actor reads it with a Perthshire accent as opposed to mine from the Scottish borders, so perhaps more comprehensible. But yeah, the book's been a real success. I've really, really enjoyed it. I would give you an example of other Napster moments facing other industries, just a really good example. I got to work with the newspaper industry. Why do we even call them newspapers? When was the last time you all held a newspaper in your hand? And they were asking me, well, what's our Napster moment? And I had to think on the top here. It's like, if you think about King's Cross Station in London, which most of your listeners will be familiar with, up until 2012 with the rebuild, it was a bit of a, if I can swear on the podcast, shithole.
You certainly can. We actively encourage it.
Okay, it was a fucking shithole.
Good man.
But then we now have A, the biggest station in Britain, and B, the biggest concourse in Britain.
Yeah.
That's important. Concourse is important. Because did anybody notice that when we rebuilt King's Cross, there was no space for WH Smiths? Since the time of the Victorians, train stations and newsagents went hand in hand. Now we have train stations without newsagents.
Yeah.
And that for me is a Napster moment if you're in the business of selling the printed press and magazines to customers who are going to sit still on a train for 4 hours. So I think that's an example of, like, you look across the board, the book's done really well with the Royal Navy. What? The Royal Navy? They asked me, I appreciate the sales, but why the Royal Navy? And they said, well, in the book chapter 4, I covered the English rock band Radiohead. Don't know if you ever
yes, I was going to ask you about that, and it was the
in Rainbows,
the free one in Rainbows. Yeah.
So
They say people pay what they want for it.
Yeah,
That's what he's leading up to. Yeah.
So I got to meet the band, Little Tom, Big Johnny, and the management to understand and how to tell this story. It's so relevant to today's society. And there's this line in there where it was pointed out to EMI Records on the run up to that record, that release of In Rainbows in 2007. The one thing that's upholding your business is killing your business. That is the CD. The fact you're so wedded to this model, and I'm sure there'll be telcos who can relate to this. The one thing that's paying your bills is what's destroying your company. You have to let go of the addiction to the CD format. And I asked the Royal Navy, well, why are you interested in my book? They said, that line. It's like, what do you mean? He said, our business depends on arguing for aircraft carriers.
Right.
And we don't even know if we need them. They're a turkey shoot for modern missiles. Yeah. They have pros, but they also have some cons.
And we like to make them and then not have any planes as well.
Well, they made one in Rosyth in Edinburgh that was too tall to get under the fourth rail.
Oh, brilliant. That's just awesome.
Johnny, that aerial is 20 feet too high. But it's just like people are beginning to reevaluate their businesses, their institutions, government statistics. I take a tank division through government statistics in the book, but just like really what's the concept Tarzan economics perhaps is worth unpacking for you, which is if we imagine Tarzan, let's imagine you, scantily clad, swinging through the jungle.
Steady.
I've seen your Instagram page. You hold on to the old vine because it gets you to the next point.
Don't let hope go with one hand before clinging on with the other.
And it keeps you above the jungle floor. What gives you the confidence to let go of that old vine and reach out to the
do
view?
a proper Tarzan swing?
And that was the essence. This book wants to give you the confidence to let go.
And I would imagine, you're only just telling me now, but I would imagine it's that single word disruption that is probably catches people's eye the most. People's eye. Like one of the things that springs to mind, you were talking about the music industry being too wedded to a dying technological paradigm. The ultimate example of that to me has always been Kodak, which was apparently really early on digital photography, but they had so much invested. And that's where you get the dysfunction of the actual organizations, because you've got the people who hold the power within an organization. They're getting all their revenue, they're getting all their super yachts and their lovely houses by the sea on the back of sales of film. Mm-hmm. And they don't want to let go. And it takes a really strong person. I always think, I'm sure to some extent you'll agree that Steve Jobs is a good example of someone who navigated disruption well. I remember when he came out with, I can't remember, but it was something that made the iPod obsolete at a time. Maybe it was the iPhone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's what it was.
Yeah. And, obviously in time, smartphones made a hell of a lot of other things, obviously, like GPS systems and digital cameras and shit like that. But, he basically said it outright. He goes, I'm killing a business line here, but it's got to be done. And obviously if Kodak had done that, then they might still be Kodak as they were in the 70s, rather than just a sort of relic now.
And Blockbuster let go of late fees to compete with Netflix.
Really? Was it as simple as late fees?
Blockbuster did more digital innovation than anyone else. They were not a dinosaur, but just this one part of the company, the cash cow that you referred to.
Interesting.
Had this late fees business. It's like, hey, don't rock my boat. That's what makes this business tick. Well,
So all Netflix
it's what's going to make
do
your
is come
business.
in and not charge late fees.
What was Netflix slogan? No late fee.
Right, I didn't know that.
3 words, which tells you don't need to see Blockbuster ever again. And that's when they were a CD, DVD format company
Yeah,
as
even
well.
when it's sent through the post, didn't you?
Yeah,
Back in the old
that's
Yeah,
what it
even
started.
Netflix was a DVD.
Yeah.
Like
And
mail order
libraries
thing.
today still impose late fees on their customers. So you want to wonder why nobody uses libraries anymore? Because they have these frigging late fees.
Although when they bring them back after 50 years and they're like 80 years old,
It gets
they
into
don't
the
seem to
local
get charged
press.
anything. just get an article in the newspaper. So
One application for your world, though, I mean, in chapter 8, which is called Big Data, Big Mistakes, where I really unpack how people drink the Kool-Aid on big data and fail to apply common sense. But just, I go to war on the NPS score, the Net Promoter Score,
Right.
yeah.
which
Yeah,
you
that gets on
guys,
my nerves.
Yeah, people
telcos,
bring
are
that
wedded
up a
to.
lot.
It needs to be fire hose off the face of the earth. I want to go
I'm with you. I'm
Scarface
with you
on this.
100%.
Say hello to my little
What's the
friend.
issue with that?
There's so many. I mean, where do I start? But one, everybody knows how the scoring works, which makes the scoring itself invalid.
you
We have
game it.
endogeneity in the model
Yeah.
as well. That's a big one for me. Two, only people who complete the transactional process are able to fill out the survey. So you're not interviewing people who didn't complete the
Self-selecting,
process,
right.
who are the ones you desperately need to win back as customers because they're the ones who are most likely to churn.
I didn't know.
Hello. But the third point of just NPS is you ask about your own proposition. Vodafone says to me, what did you think of this service? They've never asked me, have I recommended WhatsApp to a friend? And that's for me is a real tipping point, which is there's this other thing in your world called WhatsApp, which is completely off center from the telco industry. And they don't do NPS surveys. They don't do anything that telcos do, yet they've gone from zero to hero
Yeah.
in less than a decade.
That fits into a broader bugbear I have of sort of arbitrary corporate metrics on the whole.
Yeah.
And, this might be a bit more contentious, but it comes into things like ESG and all that sort of thing. And that's not to say that the components, just like the components of an NPS.
It is toast. It really is.
Yeah. Well, I'm pleased to hear it because it fucking winds me up. Not because,
What if I'm strong on E and weak on G?
well, quite.
What's the composite index here?
Well, and
It's very arbitrary anyway, isn't it? There's no kind of parameters for how you
Yeah,
measure it.
and then there's other TLAs, as I like to ironically call them, 3-letter acronyms. Although I think technically they're not an acronym unless you can make it into a pronounceable word.
That's
There we go.
abbreviation.
It's an abbreviation. Oh, well, that's still a TLA. That'll do. But yeah, so you've got ESG, you've got a few other TLAs that come under that general corporate fluffiness thing. And I stress every time I moan about them, it's not like I'm saying I don't think corporations should have more of a social conscience, although I think it's technically impossible for a corporation to have any kind of conscience. I think it's always got to be a construct. It's always got to be a sort of marketing projection. But obviously, if the net value is that a corporation is nicer to the world, be it ecologically or socially or whatever, then that's you've got to applaud that. It's just when it gets into when it becomes part of their propaganda, and they're like, we got this score, we got this score, we got this score. This shows that we're great, and it's such a crude, linear way of assessing what I think qualitative, not quantitative things for me. That really winds me up.
ESG's been handed to the marketing departments.
Yeah.
And all I need to say there is to quote Bill Hicks, which is if you work in marketing, kill yourself.
Kill yourself. Yeah.
That's what he said.
I know what you're doing there, the anti-marketing dollar. That's a good dollar. We have market research to justify that dollar. No. Kill yourself. It's a very, very clever
Right.
comedy sketch by Bill Hicks, but it just captures how things get skewed when you say, ESG, give that to the marketing team to work out what it means.
That was his last tour.
Yeah.
Because he
Right.
knew he was dying, so he went all out.
Oh, blimey. And it's not like he was holding back prior to that.
Where do
go
you
ahead,
see
sorry.
things going for? Because you mentioned the sort of newspaper industry.
Mm-hmm.
which
I was going to
is-
ask about that.
Yeah, I'm
journalism.
just intrigued because we're sort of in that, and I see these newspapers, like the traditional ones that probably wouldn't really regard themselves as newspapers anymore. They're trying to go online and they have paywalls, and to me, none of it seems to be done very well, I don't think. But I'm just kind of wondering if you see a sensible way of them trying to overcome the problems they have.
So, and I'll just butt in what I was going to say about
Kick it.
that. Talking about disruption, what has massively disrupted media and journalism, which is our day job, has been Google and Facebook primarily. Nearly all the ad money that
Yeah.
used to go to them either through display or through classified or whatever has just disappeared and gone into the hands of Google. So journalism is enormously disrupted, and I personally think it's adapted badly. I think it's getting there now, going through a more subscription. People like Wall Street Journal, FT can pull that off, but a lot of them have I think, defeated. So this is getting into a more journalism purist stage, but they've been self-defeating by doing something that is often described as pay-to-play, which is to write sort of sycophantic editorial to try and please advertisers and try and placate them and get them to advertise.
But it's also people not paying for content anymore. You used to go out and buy your newspaper in the morning that would be what?
Yeah, so you've got two major losses of revenue that are attributable to the internet, but the advertising one is attributable specifically to a couple of big companies.
Totally.
But yeah, whereas I believe that the only hope for journalism is to keep writing really good journalism as opposed to this compromised sort of kowtowing journalism to advertisers. Because the only reason anyone would bother to read Telecoms.com or Light Reading or The Telegraph or the FT is the quality of the journalism. But the problem is that so much of the money's gone out of it. So anyway, just to jump on Ian, because that would have been something that would be in my mind, we're at that disrupted inflection point.
I have intimate knowledge of the challenges facing the industry, and I've had to address many of the biggest broadsheet titles in the world and their big conferences, trying to work out why is it, let's say in the country of Britain, less than 2 million people pay for news, but more than 20 million people pay for music.
Yeah.
I mean, I understand they're different. We'll get into those differences, but why is the gap that large? Why are more people, this is either going to please or upset your listeners, why do more people listen to Joe Rogan in America than buy newspapers? Yeah. He employs 4 people in Austin, Texas. Yeah. That's it. Newspapers have buildings, fixtures,
Me and Pierre are
fittings,
big
unions.
Rogan fans.
So it's just, think about like the scale that music's made and the lack of progress newspapers made. They don't help themselves. That is, you look at the apps, they look like websites squashed into a phone. Yeah. That's not classic thing of like, it looks like this app has been designed by an organizational chart of I need this bit here and this. It's not consumer experience.
A committee. Yeah.
They don't help themselves with pricing. The pricing is really complicated. Music is simple. Here's my proposition to you guy. I got 5 fingers in this hand. Watch. It's $9.99 a month. It's not even 10. It's offline. It's ad free and it's on demand. I have 1 finger left and I've already sold it to you. Newspapers, their pricing requires a PhD to understand. I recently churned from The Economist. I've read The Economist since puberty. I left The Economist. They tried to win me back. This is their win-back proposal. 1 year for £117 and 16 pence. That's a nice charming price point. 117
16p, where's that come from?
3 years, £514 and 80 pence. Where in the laws of taxi pricing does a second mile cost more than the first? And this is The Economist, for fuck's sake.
I know.
How bizarre.
It's just like you're shooting yourselves in the foot.
Yeah.
But what you do also need to appreciate is just some structural differences. A couple of interesting ones for you. One, when you pay for music, you get rid of ads. When you pay for news, they still flood you with ads. I wonder whether there's something there.
Although the video streamers are starting to take the piss a bit on that one, aren't they?
They are. There's creaking there.
Yeah.
But the idea that ads are a deterrent versus when I paid for The Economist on that new app, they just flood me with ads saying I want to visit Dubai. I do not want to visit Dubai. I want to get to the next article. So it's intrusive ads. So that doesn't...
Is that why you churned? Because both Ian and I have long been readers of The Economist, but I stopped subscribing a little while ago. But I mainly just was feeling a bit skint.
I do because I don't always read it cover to cover, but I usually read some of it. And I used to work there actually a long time ago, not on the magazine, but the EIU part of it. And I've just sort of had a connection with it for ages. But on the newspaper side of it, one of the issues I have personally with newspapers, like trying to read the Telegraph or the Guardian, and the Guardian's free actually, isn't it? So that's not a good example. But the Telegraph or the Times,
just beg every now and then.
You as a telecom journalist, you might have a few things that are coming up in the national news, and you want to dip in, and I want to read that article, and there's no way of doing it. It's like you have to sign up to a subscription. You can, all right, the first month might be free, but then you're going on to whatever they're charging per month. There's no. And I don't know whether it is economically viable, but it's sort of micro payments. I mean, we've talked about this. I might go in and
there's a real telecom angle on this.
Read 10 articles maybe over a certain period of time.
No, I don't think that's the way to go. Let me give you the real problem, the undercurrent for all of this. Can you tell me what label Katy Perry is signed to?
No.
Can you tell me what label Adele is signed to?
No.
Yeah, it's 2 of the biggest artists in the world. You can't tell me.
Universal.
No.
I could guess.
You got one last guess and there's 3 majors in the world. Good luck. So hold on a second. You can't tell me who these artists are signed to. That would be, in newspaper world, what you call a masthead. What you know is Katy Perry is on Spotify. You pay for the brand of Spotify,
but to
and
get
you're
Katy Perry.
agnostic to the label. In fact, the label is just an irrelevant aspect. What newspapers are trying to do is you pay for the New York Times. You pay for the Financial Times. And that, I think, removes the option value that Spotify brings. Maybe I like the New York Times, but I really like Brooke Masters writing in the Financial Times, and I can't afford 2 subscriptions given what you're asking, therefore I'll pay for none.
So what's the solution to that?
So then if you follow that logic, and I'm saying this is one possible solution, but if you follow that logic, do you need a Spotify for news? If you could just give 10 quid a month and access all the content in the world,
Yeah.
would 20 million people pay for that in the UK? Because if they did,
Apple News.
the newspaper revenues would be way bigger than before.
So
Now,
Peter says Apple News.
let's just come to Apple and Google News. Apple News is interesting. Not a lot of people are in there, but it's got the potential to evolve. They've got the Apple One bundle. It's part of that. But Google News is really baffling because Google has given over $1 billion to appease the newspaper industry. You've seen the settlements in Australia, God knows how many projects, FT
Canada's
strategies.
got stuff going on as well.
Yeah, they do that. So they do everything to try and help the newspaper industry. Then they build the Google News app, which is more popular than all other newspaper apps combined. And the one thing the Google News app makes you think is, I never have to pay for content ever again. So it's like, well, they give with one hand, they take it away with the other. It's not Google's fault, just the strategies back to front in terms of how can you build a Google News app and then say, let's do everything we can to help the newspaper industry. This app is brilliant. It's genius. I can get local news from Edinburgh, international news about conflicts in the Middle East, all in one beautiful place curated. Way better than any other newspaper app. But I don't need to pay. Where's the checkout? Where's the dollar symbol?
Yeah.
And that's just another example of like tech, telecoms, content, just triangulating this problem.
Well, that was one of the reasons Ian mentioned micropayments. It's interesting that it doesn't, it's not something that intuitively works for you, because that's something that telecoms could facilitate, although they've done a shit job of it. One thing we talk a lot about, as I'm sure you gathered, a typical podcast will be much more in the weeds on telecoms than this one is. And there's a subset of technology in the telecoms business called BSS, which basically determines the billing relationship between your provider and you. So how you get your bill from EE or whatever. And that's always been viewed that there's a potential there for there to be a much more sophisticated sort of commercial relationship between you and your provider. And sometimes people try it, and your KPN example seemed like a great example of that. But in those intervening 11 years, the telecoms industry hasn't done a great job of replicating things like your KPN Spotify experience.
I know.
And one thing that occurred to me was if they could get their shit together, facilitating micropayments seemed like a really good idea to me. So it's interesting that it just
calling BS on BSS. I'm fighting back.
So you have heard of
acronym laden industry here.
I think we've led with that a couple of times on headlines, haven't we? Calling BS on BS, something similar. But yeah.
Do you remember the worst acronym in the world was when the European Commission had assault on the credit card companies with the multilateral interchange linear fee investigation, which was MILF. It was just really, really hard to hold a straight face during that court case.
Excellent.
But on micropayments, you know why you're geeking out on that? Is because you can measure them. And it's easy to mobilize your thoughts around what you can measure. It's a lot harder to think about what you can't measure. And what matters most is often measured least. And what I'm leading to here is option value. It's not what you did with your account, it's what you could have done with your account. And I think the option value of Spotify for $9.99, you have every song in the world. If I travel to Timbuktu tomorrow and somebody said there's this band playing, I know they're in my pocket. Might not, might never happen, but I can do it. Think about a gym. Maybe you want to have micropayments. Maybe clearly you're in good shape, and let's try that again. Clearly you're in good shape, and you use a gym. Okay, so the only thing you use in the gym is a treadmill. The micropayment argument says, why don't you just pay for the treadmill as opposed to the gym? But the reason you joined the gym in the first place is not because of the treadmill. In fact, you would never have joined a gym if it only had a treadmill. Maybe you got a back injury. And then once that back injury resolves, you're on that rowing machine giving it your best. You can use all this apparatus without any friction. The fact you could is the option value. Not that you should or that you would, it's the fact that you could use it.
Fair enough.
And that's where I think telcos, with their brilliant engineering minds, miss the overall. The fog gets in their way, which is sell the option value, not the micropayments.
Okay. That's good stuff. So I'm aware that you're running up against time. There was just one little area that I thought might be of sort of mutual interest to all of us was sort of generally regulation. So I listened to one of your I haven't really given it much of a plug. So you do this podcast with Richard Kramer, is it?
Yeah.
And it's called Bubble Trouble. And I was just listening to the latest one today, which was not necessarily germane to our conversation now because it was about sort of financial markets and private financial markets. It's quite arcane in that area. I found it really interesting, though, partly because of the opacity of it all. It's just mad. But I listened to another one where you were talking about gatekeepers. And I think you had an expert guest on that one.
Partners, yeah.
And this was gatekeepers in the context of some regulation that has been coming out of Europe, the Digital Markets Act and some digital something else thing. And they're designating these sort of about 5 American big tech companies as sort of internet gatekeepers. So the usual suspects, I think it's sort of Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, maybe. I can't remember. These are the usual FANG ones.
You have to hit it with an acronym.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I always joke about that acronym because I think they only put the N in so it doesn't make a pejorative in American terms. But anyway, so you had a podcast about that, and it's something we write about a fair bit, although it's sort of telecoms adjacent rather than core to what we do. But I just thought, I mean, I'm trying to formulate a sort of a more precise question to throw at you, but just a sort of sense of the regulatory environment, not so much telecoms, but the tech business on the whole. And I think especially this paradigm of the EU butting heads with American big tech. Do you think the EU's playing it right? Do you have any thoughts on that paradigm?
Well, on the gatekeeper point, it was interesting for your audience to learn that iCloud messaging falls beneath the gatekeeper threshold. So Apple actually went on record and said, we wouldn't qualify as a gatekeeper because not enough people are using iCloud messaging.
Even though... So it's got to be a particular service, not the parent
you
company.
qualify by volume of users.
Right.
I see.
So whatever you set a threshold, you're always going to create anomalies. That's really
Yeah.
interesting for a telco audience to think about that, which is some of the biggest companies have services within their structure which are up for regulation, which fall beneath the threshold. So what do? You change the threshold? It's interesting. The gatekeeper thing, it always feels like regulation is slow.
It does, especially in tech.
It feels like it's really regulatory fatigue, I think is the official term for this, but like playing catch up with these models as well. Also, just by jurisdiction, like what can you regulate within European Union, which we were one part of, given that I think 10% of Apple's business is Europe, so 90% is immune from this. So, think about that. Also, market definition. Is Amazon a dominant online retailer or a fairly small overall retailer? Discuss.
Right.
We set the market definition as well. What I would give your audience, though, is the greatest lesson in regulation of all time, which came from Screaming Lord Sutch, who led the Monster Arabian Looney Party.
Yep, remember that.
For 40 plus years. He lost, I think, 70 by-elections with pride, colourful character, crazy policies.
I mean, like a definitive protest vote sort of person.
Absolutely.
Yeah. You vote for him because you're saying it's all bollocks. So I might as well vote for this nutter.
Right, but then his loony policies actually had some substance. I mean, deregulating radio, allowing those pirate radio stations to come on shore, was one, lowering the voting age, relaxing licensing hours to reduce crime. He had one policy, which is to invent a £20 note that if you dropped it into a puddle, it wouldn't sink to the bottom. And that way you have a floating currency. He also argued, one of my favourite ones, we'll come back to Telcoville in a second, that traffic wardens should pick up dog poo and that way they'd be more appreciated. I mean, the marginal cost of a traffic warden, what do they do? They
while they're there.
All day. Yeah. Do something more productive than sticking stickers on cars and remove the dog poo.
It's an offsetting thing, isn't it?
Yeah, these are genius policies. Yeah. Anyway, his greatest policy of all time was he said we need 2 competition authorities. And I champion this in life because who's to say that a monopoly in charge of upholding competition knows what the right policy should be? Regulators get tied in knots because they're monopolies. Yep. You've seen it in the online harms bill, which has become like a Christmas tree bill because everyone's putting stuff on it.
Oh, don't get me started,
I want privacy, but I want to prevent defamation, offensive images being sent on WhatsApp. Well, pick one or pick the other, but you can't have both.
Yeah.
Do you understand what the word encryption actually means here? And you can see how regulation gets tied up in knots. I believe if we had competition for regulation, the world would be a better place.
So how would that play out, though? I mean, for it to be competition, you've got to have at least 3. You've got to have an odd number for there to be a winning group, haven't you?
All right, let's take this alcohol-fueled idea a little bit further. You kind of already do, because what you've seen in Europe is regulatory authorities pushing each other to say, back off, I'm going to regulate Facebook Meta in France. Back off, I'm going to take on Google in Germany. So you do, but that's irrational regulation. What I just want to see is I want to see a competition for ideas for what is the purpose of this regulation? For whom are we regulating? Is it the consumer?
Yes.
Is it the wholesale
So it's
market?
to be able to stress test a bit of regulation properly.
Were you awake when you studied economics and you had that lecture on the word monopsony?
Yeah, I heard you talk about that on the most recent pod. Can you redefine that for us?
Well, what is a monopoly?
A single company.
Yeah, right. So if you studied economics today, if you have to pay for education in England, you don't in Scotland, which means you can buy more alcohol instead. But
Not that the Scots ever do. We push back on that cliche.
So in England, so if you studied economics today at London School of Economics, they would say a monopoly reduces output and increases costs. That's the essence of it. I'm going to withdraw supply and jack up prices.
Yeah, which is why cartels, for example, are not allowed because it's the same effect.
Right. What do tech companies do? What's in their DNA? They expand output and they eliminate costs.
Like Google that gives everything away for free.
How much have you spent on Google Maps?
Yeah, or anything Google.
When you look at your direct debit, you use Google Maps every day.
I do actually now pay Google for Google One. But it took me years of fighting and having to constantly trim down my like Gmail attachments to stay below their threshold.
But hold this thought for a second, because that means that the monopoly is not behaving like the textbook would prescribe.
Yeah.
So how do you regulate if the regulators come from that old school world of monopolies reduce output, increase costs, and we're seeing the exact opposite happen? That doesn't fit. Secondly, why do we talk about tech monopolies? I want everyone on this listening to this podcast to think hard here. You can't use plural when describing a monopoly. We're surrounded by all these tech monopolies. Really? Sounds like a pretty fucking competitive market. How many tech monopolies do you need?
Let me be a pedant.
Specific markets,
Let me be a pedant on that one to the point that I think Ian was just in the halfway through making.
It's like there's a lot of tech.
You got one monopoly per segment.
So
per
the search market is all Google, really. I mean, I know Bing's there now, and it's 20% of the market. Maybe it's more than that. But
you're absolutely right. But let's go back to the language. Well, we don't discuss monopolies in that language. What you need to use is the word monopsony, which is a one-sided monopoly, which will give it all away to the customer, but put a stranglehold on the wholesale market of providers. That's what a monopsony is.
Right, interesting.
And I just don't understand why the word monopsony seems to have dropped off a cliff.
No.
We get tangled up in this language, which doesn't help the debate.
The etymology of that. But
I've never come across.
I'd never heard that term.
Most people fall asleep in that lecture at university, or too drunk or stoned to take notes. And then when you turn over the examination at the end of your term, it's like, oh, I'm not going to do that one. But if you actually dust down those books and read up on monopsony, then all of a sudden it makes sense. But having a fierce debate in the pub about how to regulate tech monopolies and using the plural when what they do is the opposite of monopolies. It just ends up in a cul-de-sac.
Are the regulators sort of oblivious to this stuff?
I've been to some of these Brussels conferences with regulators, and it baffles me. You just mentioned search. Credit to you. All right, maybe Google has a dominant position in search. Stop the bus. We do a lot of our searching not on search anymore. We search through apps. Indeed, I would argue that those search queries that we have the highest value for are the ones we leave Google for and go to our apps. I need to know when that train to Scotland's going to go tonight, so I'll use the LNER app to find out. I didn't use Google.
Yeah.
So, all right, this sounds all a bit trivial.
Search on Amazon.
Yeah. So this is all sounding a bit trivial, but then surface up. How do you define a market when you're talking about a monopoly?
Yeah.
Search is not just a search bar search. Search is lots of things.
I think they're like, you said it yourself, but to sort of be sympathetic towards them, it's such a fast changing market, isn't it? That trying to stay ahead of it.
Yeah.
It's not like regulating the sort of oil markets of old where nothing much changed. Maybe there's a slightly better bit of engineering equipment they're using to do some drilling at some point. But
what's the regulator? Thierry in France.
Breton. He's on a tear at the moment.
I remember once he was on a panel and he said, Facebook is a monopoly because it's a fundamental part of human life. I raised my hand and said, do you have a Facebook account? He said, no.
For God's sake.
Not that fundamental. Neither do I.
I just had a former guest of ours, Dean Bubley, eyeing me about, I was commenting on Breton's haircut on the last pod. It's a bit big for my liking.
It's quite bouffant.
It's quite bouffant. But no, he's really on a tear, especially now that Vestager, who used to be his sort of counterweight among these senior mandarins at the EU, she now wants to go and join like the European Investment Bank or something.
Central Bank, I think.
Right. And Breton's now, it seems like, he's the most powerful bloke in Europe by the sounds of it, certainly when it comes to our space. But yeah, no, I mean, that's a really interesting point about monopoly versus monopsony. Did I get that right?
That's right.
3 beers in. And I find all this stuff, I find it really interesting, like beyond my day job, because I just find the dynamics of power interesting. And I define power, I've whittled it down. I spend a lot of time thinking about this, and this might be a bit of an anticlimax as I've framed it as the life work of my sort of cogitation. But I define it as who decides.
Yeah.
Basically, power is who decides. Anytime something comes up, it comes down to who decides, and the person who decides is the one who wields power, and the people who don't decide are the ones who don't wield power. And so,
second that emotion.
Right, cool. So that will come up. It could come up in regulation. It could come up in my bugbear that I've bored this pod, listeners to this pod about many times, of censorship. Of, you talked about the online. They actually call it the online safety bill, I think, not the online harms bill, but it often gets called that. And that talks about a thing called legal but harmful, which really winds me up, because what I understand that we have to have law. I'm not an anarchist, but if you've then got regulation or in this case legislation, but that explicitly says within the legislation that the scope of this legislation is stuff that isn't illegal, then what the fuck is going on there? So all that stuff really does my head in, and I think Breton's trying a bit of that right now, which I won't get into now because it's an extremely sensitive subject, but he's on a bit of a censorship drive right now. Again, he's testing those fringes. And maybe he's right. Maybe in every case he's right. But I get the impression that these regulators and these supranational, unelected legislators and regulators are always testing the boundaries of how they can expand their power incrementally, one slice at a time. Yeah,
and to maybe put a wrapper on this discussion around regulation, the one thing that bugs me most with this crazy world of regulation, if we go back to the car park and All the President's Men, what did Deep Throat say to us? Follow the money.
Yeah.
These fines, where does the money go?
Yeah.
Because they don't go to the people harmed by the abusive behaviour of the dominant player.
Yeah.
They go into the pool.
They go into the pension pot.
It's expensive lunches.
Yeah, my big bugbear is with the EU, because I was a leaver in the Brexit vote. And I'm not totally anti the EU, but I guess I'm framing myself as relatively hostile to the EU. And I always characterise them as just having these massive lunches with extremely expensive wines and all that sort of thing, because they're so unaccountable, and they can find people
you can't audit the EU. It's never been audited. You don't have KPMG going in there to do books. The European Commission has never been audited.
Yeah. So it feels very unaccountable, and obviously people like Thierry Breton were not elected.
Yeah.
But I'm certainly not going to get us down, especially with the very limited time we have down the Brexit rabbit hole.
So here's the exclusive stat I've done for your podcast on fines.
Uh-huh.
How many times has Google been slapped around the knuckles by the European Commission? Can you remember?
Quite a few. I've certainly written about a few.
Fines in total to date, and we can debate this, is north of 8 billion euros.
Wow.
Maybe north of 9. I put it at 8.3. You'll have people listening to this podcast who can do a far better calculation than me. I don't know how many have actually been paid over, how many are stuck in appeal, but that's the total levy. That means Google, YouTube have paid more in fines to the European Commission than they've paid in copyright to European creators. Now, I just want you to step back and think, that is a trivial, spurious, completely unconnected step. But hold on.
It's not, no.
Allocation of resources.
Yeah.
You've paid more to the European Commission in fines than you've paid in copyright. Is that a good allocation of resources?
Yeah.
Does that achieve the desired end? That's where it baffles me, the whole fines business.
Oh.
So if we had competition for regulation, the fines should come down.
And there are so many examples of that. Like in our space, we've got things like spectrum auctions. And you get
that's fun and games.
Yeah,
that's a big economics one. That one.
Yeah, and you get operators. Yeah. Well, obviously, we certainly haven't got the time to get into the actual game theory of auctions and all that sort of thing. But then you'll get headlines going, UK gets 8 billion for this spectrum. You're like, well, no, the UK didn't. I didn't fucking get it. And
the air you breathe.
And in fact, I've ended up paying it because then that's baked into. That's baked into my goddamn phone bill. So yeah, all those things. Listen, go on.
I was going to say that the fines thing is not restricted to the EC, though, is it? We've got I mean, we've talked about this before. Ericsson having to pay over big fines to the DOJ in America, and you just think, where does the money go? It doesn't go into. It doesn't go towards the victims, the guys that were exploited by Ericsson, supposedly. It just goes into the pot of American money for, I don't know, buying another aircraft carrier or whatever. But
And fines are often treated as a cost of doing business anyway. So what did it actually achieve?
Yeah.
Yeah, especially when you've got really big companies with very clever, highly educated people who are doing the maths and going, okay, we've had to pay $1 billion, but by flouting this rule, we've earned $10 billion. Well, we're 9 bill up. So listen, I think we're running out of time. Is that right?
10 more minutes.
Yeah. Okay. You got a little bit more time. I mean, on that. Well, do you know what? I think we've done the regulation thing. I think what I'd like to do is sort of throw it to you more generally on economics. Maybe thinking of some of the bubble trouble chats you've had recently. Obviously, we're a B2B podcast focused on telecoms, but the macroeconomic picture affects everyone. And it was interesting. I think you were asking your co-podcaster today, what's going on? Where are we in a sort of macro cycle? And it is a bit weird. That's something I think about. I've got a tiny amount of investment, like, hundreds of pounds that I've just sort of dabbled around on a thing called, God, what's it called? Free shit, I've forgotten. Some app.
FTX, was it that cryptocurrency?
No, it wasn't even crypto. I've never gone anywhere near crypto. Free trade, I think it's called. And I've just bought a few bits and bobs, and I did all right. It's obvious that immediately after the pandemic happened, there was a sudden cliff that we fell off, and it's obvious everything was undervalued then. And if I'd had more money, I would have just chucked it left, right, and centre, because almost everything went up a couple of years later. But one thing that strikes me, we're now towards the end of 2023. We're at least a year or so clear of the pandemic and all that sort of thing, but things haven't really sort of picked up. So I guess it's a hell of a big question. And obviously, if you had a definitive answer, you wouldn't be here. You'd be sitting on a beach somewhere. But, what's going on cyclically? Because it all feels a little bit weird right now.
Interest rates have gone up. Inflation's gone up.
Yeah.
And we're still in a rather unusual world of the spread between interest rates and inflation is still quite large. So
Right.
putting money in your bank account loses you wealth.
Right.
So we haven't had...
Thankfully, I haven't got any.
We haven't had a normal world. And when I say normal, how about this? 2.5% economic growth, 2.5% inflation, base rate 5, banks lend for
Which
6.
it was for decades.
Yeah. When banking made common sense. But it's trying to explain to somebody putting your money in an HSBC saving account will lose you this much a year.
Yeah.
Well, I don't get this.
You actually get value going down the pub and getting
16
paid.
years of that.
Yeah.
There are kids doing GCSE economics at school today who have never lived in an environment where interest rates were above the rate of inflation. That's nuts. So it is nuts. I think the bond market's picked up, which means the tech market's cooled down. And private markets, there's some weird stuff going on. You're seeing private equity companies buy and sell each other's assets just to hold the price up. Which, of our podcast, and credit to my co-host Richard Kramer, Arete Research, a very famous telco analyst, very, very forthright talker. He has this wonderful expression. I'm going to try and do a New York accent for you. He says, you know what happens when your stock falls by 90%? That meant it fell by 80%, then it halved.
Right.
It's very clear, then we lost all hope. But he made a point on a podcast we did last year, March 22. I come back from South by Southwest, big music, film, game festival. And we had no script for the podcast. It was just an intuitive conversation. So I just want to know what's been going on. And I said there was more queues for people wearing metaverse headsets than there was for people seeing bands on stage. And I found that weird. There was more demand for NFTs than there were for concert tickets. I found that weird. And I said, what?
Do those both feel bubbly now?
They burst.
Yeah.
If there's a bubble that burst, we pierced it first, because I said to Richard, what I don't understand about NFTs is I've heard they're subject to something called a wash trade. What's a wash trade? Just genuinely interested. And he explained it so eloquently. He said, well, let's imagine I've got a unique NFT to my area of New York here, and you've got a unique NFT to your area of the Scottish borders there, and we bought them both for $1,000 each. Let's trade for $2,000. Let's trade again for $3,000. Let's trade again for $4,000 or $5,000. Let's ladder the whole price up to $10,000. And what's the golden rule of finance? Everybody needs a sucker. Sucker comes along and says, fuck me, they bought that NFT for $1,000, they're trading it for 10, I'll pay 20. And that's what a wash trade is. You just wash the value of the transaction through.
Feels a little bit like the 2008 thing. That excellent Michael Lewis book, the Big Short on it.
Yeah, absolutely. So to learn that's what was driving NFTs was wash trades, made illegal by the US government in 1936, rampant in the world of tech. Then you look at today's market where the private market is wash trading assets amongst themselves. I think there's some bubble trouble ahead.
Dodgy. And it's so dodgy, like cartels. We all know cartels are bad.
Yeah.
And yet this wash trade stuff feels like cartel behaviour to me.
When it was explained to me, and I encourage your listeners to go to that pod, the pod's called NFTs Are Not For Me, just Richard's explanation of it is so clear. The first thing that went into my head, leaving the world of business for a second, was football agents.
Yeah.
How can you justify a defender for 50 million quid these days? Because the agents are just wash trading the players amongst themselves. It's not about the team, it's about the transactions as well.
I always find that interesting from a journalistic point of view, because I would have thought the majority of the rumour stories that come up in sports pages are planted by agents
exactly
as well.
What's on the back of an agent's business card? My mission is your commission.
Yeah.
So I give that as a trouble. The other area where I think is, to turn the frowns upside down, where I think there's good news ahead, but I don't think our central bank gets it, is how we measure inflation. Give me the mic for a second just to explain this. So I think we have a huge challenge on our hands trying to figure out what government stats tell us and what they don't tell us. And in the afterword to my book Pivot, I take this head on and I fact check this with the ONS, which is we capture inflation. A coffee and a croissant and Pret cost more this year than it did last year. There is inflation in the economy. But that's only part of the story. There is deflation. Let's imagine you, Scott, married, kids, live in Reading, work in London. It's compulsory travel. Get your arse into office, come in from Reading to London. This is not discretionary travel.
Yeah.
That's the most expensive seasonal train ticket in Britain. It comes in at £5,996 a year.
Damn.
Outside your mortgage, outside school fees if there is any, that's got to be the biggest line item on your family budget. And I'm Scott's boss. And I say, Scott, post-pandemic, work from anywhere. Work from home.
So that's a pre-tax $8-9 grand pay rise.
Right.
Yeah.
But it's hugely deflationary. And I press the ONS. The way I work as an economist, I'm like,
why it's deflationary.
Because I'm ripping that out of your family budget. If the bottle of Pantene shampoo gets cheaper, that's deflationary. If commuting to work gets cheaper, that's deflationary.
I understand now. Okay.
And I just lost the plot with the ONS saying, I'm like a dog on heat. If I see something that doesn't make sense, I'm like, where is that? Where's commuting in the inflation basket? It affects everybody listening to this podcast.
Well, that basket, every now and then you get a new story about how they put croissants in the basket.
They just make a discretionary of this goes in and that goes out.
Yeah.
Well, what if it doesn't?
But it's just consumer goods. It's not other behaviour.
Do you have commuting to work in your basket? They said, no, we have all travel. So I might not need to commute to work anymore, but because my mum and dad are high risk in the pandemic, I go to Scotland more. That's discretionary, not compulsory. They can't separate.
I see.
I said, do you apply weights to the commuting and travel costs? They say, we do, but there's a problem. I was like, what do you mean? The weights that we apply are 2 years out of date. So when the world stopped in 2020, we didn't understand the cost of commuting, and the weights it was based on stemmed from 2018. I'm telling you, these stats are utter horseshit.
Yeah.
We are not capturing the deflationary effects in this economy. And to wrap it up, and I even heard Andrew Bailey, our governor, sort of mutter words to this effect. And to be honest, I wouldn't give him a job in a shoe shop. But it's like people are using their excess savings built up in the pandemic to pay for the cost of inflation today. It's there.
It's all baked in.
We've had deflation in the economy, but we didn't measure it. Did interest rates have to go up to where they were?
So in summary, you think inflation's lower if it's measured properly?
If measured properly, people's budgets do experience inflation.
And interest rates didn't need to go that high.
And if I'm paying a little bit more for a coffee and croissant and Pret, but I'm not paying £6,000 a year for a train ticket, net, I'm probably better off.
So to finish off, because I know we're definitely running out of time now.
It's been great.
It has been great. And I'll say now, you're welcome back any time. So especially if you've got anything vaguely telecoms adjacent, just let me know and we'll get you back on, because I've really enjoyed it. But so there's nothing to do with telecoms. Is inflation and therefore interest rates and therefore people's, if they got to refinance their mortgage, is it going to continue to go down? I'm going to ask you to be Nostradamus here.
I think mortgage rates will come down. I think the market will come down. I don't have much faith in the way that Andrew Bailey and the Bank of England currently act.
No.
I wish we had somebody like Andy Haldane, who's now at the Royal Society of the Arts, in charge of that. It's like real, you don't want to use the word blue sky thinker because you sound like a wanker, but just somebody who just comes with a blank sheet of paper. So Mervyn King challenged the governor of the Bank of England saying, do you have a theory of inflation? And he mumbled the answer. So you don't have a theory of that's helpful.
And we had that Canadian bloke who just seemed like a politician.
Yeah. It's just, but I mean, question the statistics that are driving these decisions. Can I maybe, there's a great story told in my book about this.
Go for it, man.
As we're on the subject of central bank governors, Andy Haldane gets quoted in my book because he quoted Spotify. He said in 2018, he said, I might use Spotify data to predict the next recession.
Wow.
And we had a PR shitstorm on our hands. Is Spotify trading private user data with the Bank of England, and is that going to affect our mortgage rates? No. So we got him to come in and apologise. Sorry, I was just referring to a paper I saw in America about streaming data and economic cycles, and made a flippant remark, and apology accepted. But Andy, what did you mean by that? And he said this, and I want your audience to really dial in on this one. He said, as it currently stands, I've got a 3-month-old, so a 6-month-old survey from manufacturing from Solihull to base interest rates on. Who fucking knows who filled out the survey? Was it some intern with a pencil? That's what they base their decision on. All these
data.
PhD econometric data. No, you got a survey which says the NPS index is up or it's down, whatever. PMI index, pardon me. He says that's it. He said, and at that point in time, we had Brexit and it wasn't going particularly well. And there's a lot of Europeans living in this country who didn't know they could continue living here because we hadn't got settled status through. He said, I believe there's a lot of anxiety in the economy. For better or for worse, there's a lot of anxiety. And I believe anxiety matters more to setting interest rates than a 3-month-old manufacturing survey from Solihull. And I would look anywhere for signals of anxiety to understand what to do with monetary policy. And I wanted to hug him and have his memories.
Yeah, I'm with you 100%.
Just to wrap it up.
Go ahead.
So guess what? So back to, can you get signals from anxiety from music, which could affect economic policy? Right. So then I had to go back to him.
Who's listening to Radiohead?
Well, when did we go into lockdown? On my birthday, the 13th of March, 2020. Okay?
Right. Oh, happy birthday.
You know what the number one song on Spotify was that day? It's The End of the World as we know it, and I Fly by R.E.M.
Oh my God. And you don't think that was a coincidence?
And I gave it to Andy, said, you've got to go to press with this, and he actually announced it in one of his press briefings, which is, we know things are tough, but it's not the end of the world as we know it. Thank you, Michael Stipe. But that was the number one song on Spotify that day. So you can find signals
because it gives you some sense of psychology. It might not be as explicit as the title of the song, but that's why I guessed Radiohead, because they're a little bit more downbeat. I'm a fan of Radiohead, but they're a bit more downbeat. But yeah, I'll wrap it up here because we have to, because we run out of time. But if we ever do that reciprocal book buying, you'll see that apart from I find economics interesting, but I also find psychology interesting, as I'm sure that you know far better than I do. Economics and psychology overlap massively.
And behavioral economics is psychology.
Yeah, and it gets understated. And I think in a recent podcast in fact, it was the one I was just listening to today. You were talking about how actually, I can't remember what the term used. You can probably tell me, but a lot of the time when people are prognosticating and when they're guessing markets, they're actually guessing irrational behavior rather than like core, like hard data and all that sort of things. It's all to do with psychology, and of course it is, because you're dealing with human beings.
You show me the incentives and I'll show you the outcomes.
There we go. Any humanity, including economics, is about psychology because it's about human beings. All right, man. We better wrap it up because we've all got places to go. That was brilliant. And I mean it. Anytime. Keep in touch. Absolutely. It was a really good chat.
And for our podcast, Bubble Trouble, just a very quick plug. We're rattling towards our 100th episode.
Cool.
And late last night, we confirmed our guest for the 100th episode, which is the reason why I want to do the podcast. For anyone who can remember the days of Enron at the time of the millennium.
Oh, yeah.
And what I think is one of the greatest books and documentaries ever, The Smartest Guys in the Room, Bethany McLean. We've confirmed Andy Fastow for the 100th episode. Remind us who he was? The CFO of Enron that took. And
so you're going to get under the skin of what went on?
His first ever podcast will be on Bubble Trouble, the 100th episode.
Really? He's never in all that time?
I've seen him talk, and then I'll be very honest with a room full of strangers here. I cried, not because of his story, but because of the story happened where he said, how is it possible that I, Andy Fastow, can hold these two things in my hands within the space of 6 months? The CFO of the year and a 6-year prison sentence.
Yes. Talk about
and I just think
roundabouts.
Something is
Wow.
The reason why we did our podcast was for me to get Andy Fester on the show, and we confirmed him last night. So
Wow, well done.
I would love
Congratulations.
to send that link.
So
out
this
to your
feels like a sort of professional culmination. It's coinciding with your 100th episode.
Yeah, it's the one I
handy,
always
isn't it?
wanted, and I've heard him speak, and it's pretty moving in terms of how does the world work? Why, like the boy who cried wolf? Why do we always find ourselves getting back into bubble troubles?
Yes. So Bubble Trouble, I get it on Podcast Addict, where I get all my stuff, and which is where you can get Telecoms.com one as well. So I recommend you check it out. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Great.